Good morning, everyone. And my name is Paul Edwards. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at Foxtel. Welcome to this Page Roundtable. We've got a great turnout with members and friends from Page in Australia, Japan, and the US. So, look, I'd just like to start this meeting somewhat unusually and say this week is NAIDOC Week in Australia. It's a week where we celebrate the history, culture, and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country and say I'm hosting this meeting today on the traditional lands of the Gadigal, Bidjigal and Birrabirragal clans, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. One of the great things about Page is the connection and learning we have with peers. And the access to the best thinking about the profession from the US and around the world. One of those opportunities is the spring conference that Page holds each year, usually held in New York in April. I remember many very cold Aprils wandering around downtown New York, but this year it was online for obvious reasons, and I think the time zones made it a bit tricky to access that live. So I thought it might be a good idea just to get some of the luminaries from Page in the US to come and give us a bit of a recap of the spring conference and the key themes. So I'd like to introduce the Page Society Chair, Charlene Wheeless. She's the former CCO at Bechtel. Roger Bolton, who is the president of Page, and Mike Fernandez, another luminary, the CCO from Enbridge. I'm also hosting this with Peter Dubrasini, who's from Page, but now lives in Australia. I think he's ensconced in Fitzroy in Melbourne at the moment. Mm-hmm. And I also just want to acknowledge Eric Towns, who's done all the behind-the-scenes work to put this together. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Roger. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. Thanks for gathering such a great group. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces and a few new ones as well. And I look forward to a great conversation. I'm going to share screen and just give us a few slides, and then we're going to go back to take the slides down so that we can all see each other and have an actual conversation. But it really is, I'm grateful to Paul for continuing to lead not only our Australia group, but also to co-lead with Brian Lott, our international committee. And it's been one of our major efforts, as we all know, over the last few years to be a truly international organization. And Paul's certainly a major contributor to that, along with Peter Dubrasini, my colleague at Page, who is head of international for us. And I'm grateful to both of you for everything that you do. Paul has asked me to, well, here we are, the three of us who will be speaking. Paul has asked me to say just a few quick words about what's going on at Page, and then we'll get into the substance. Our new strategic plan has 4 parts: belong, connect, inspire, and learn. It's all about building and strengthening our community over the next 3 years during the course of this strategic plan. Belong is about who we are, and it's our goal to become more diverse, more inclusive, and to significantly improve the sense of belonging over the next 3 years. And a lot of the work that Paul and Peter have been leading goes right to the heart of that. Connect is all about meetings like this, where we get together increasingly virtually. You can see the huge spike in the number of events that we had, largely because of the pivot to virtual. Page conversations have become quite a staple of our ongoing conversations with each other. But we're also committed to meeting together again in person, and the Page Annual Conference will be a hybrid event with people participating both virtually and in person in Washington, D.C. at the Watergate Hotel from September 26 to 28 of this year. Inspire is about the content. I think most of you are probably familiar with the Pacesetter report, which is our most recent. We're currently hard at work building CCO guides and case studies that are related to Pacesetter. And then in the course of this 3-year strategic plan, we'll be updating that with new research. And in the meantime, sending lots of information around with the podcast and page views and all kinds of other things. If you have any trouble at all finding our content, please contact me directly. I would love to help you find it. And the fourth and newest piece of our strategic plan is about learning. And the big news here is the Page Learning Lab, which we've just released. We've just started to sign up people. It's got great page-related content. And I would strongly encourage any of you who have team members or yourselves who want to learn more about the Page way of thinking about the role of the Chief Communication Officer. It's really quite a rich experience. Okay, enough of that. Let's go on to the substance of the content for today. I've got 3 things that I kind of want to summarize very quickly. First is the opening session moderated by Don Baer from Burson Marsteller, with Tom Friedman of the New York Times and Nancy Gibbs, formerly editor-in-chief of Time Magazine, now at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University, in which Tom said, using kind of English as a second language way of talking, he said, "Country not right." And my reaction to that was, world not right. And I actually blogged about this and kind of observed that Friedman's very interesting take is that people feel somehow not at home in their own country. There's division driven by technology and demographics and climate and other factors. And Nancy Gibbs said that disinformation and division are unfortunately good business for too many in politics and media. And they talked about the importance and need for business to be a place where people pull together. And Friedman talked about the importance of what he called complex adaptive coalitions, in which business works with NGOs and governments. And Gibbs talked about the work that they're doing at the Shorenstein Center to provide resources on misinformation and disinformation. And she referred to us, the CCOs, as the essential workers of information, and offered their work on misinformation and disinformation as a resource to us. My second session I'd like to just quickly mention is the one moderated by Andrew Solinger, the publisher of Foreign Policy, with Glenn Fukushima, who was actually a colleague of mine at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative many years ago. He was our Japan specialist, and now he's at Center for American Progress. And Richard Harrington, who's affiliated with APCO and is a former MP in the UK. And they talked about bridging divides. And Harrington observed that, the rise of the British Empire and the rise of America were times of conflict, trade, and economic tensions. And so it's not so surprising that we're finding the same with the rise of China. And he appealed for the Western countries to pull together to do a better job of effectively and constructively confronting China. And Glenn talked about climate change, nuclear proliferation, and pandemics as being truly global issues where even China and the US and the rest of the Western democracies ought to be able to work together. And the final one was a session where chief communication officers, led by John Harris of Conagra, with Lori Shallow of Chipotle, Andy Farrow of Mars, and Michael McGrew of Constellation Brands, talked about how the CCO stepped up over the last 18 months or so and did incredibly remarkable work. And Andy said, many of the corporate affairs skills came to the fore. I'm quoting him, we're used to having to make calls with imperfect information. We're used to having to make quick judgments and to live with them. The whole of the last year was dealing with imperfect information about the pandemic and effects, and we were well set up to handle that. Our role in helping to keep employees safe meant that the role of our function was an absolute business imperative. Both Lori and Michael talked about the importance of mental health and the work that they did at their companies. And John talked about Refuse to Lose sessions that they did at Conagra with the Born This Way Foundation, led by Lady Gaga and her mother, Cynthia Germanata. So those are my highlights. And let me turn to Charlene now and ask for hers, and then we'll move on to Mike and then open up for conversation. Charlene?
Great. Thank you, Roger. I appreciate it. Make sure I'm off of mute. I don't make that mistake. So, two sessions that I am going to talk about. One was on DE&I and accelerating change, and how do we accelerate change with DE&I? And our primary speaker was Mark Carter, who is the founder of the Diverse Future Program, which hopefully you all are familiar with. This page is quite involved with it. And he was interviewed by Elizabeth Vargas, who's the former ABC World News Tonight anchor. And, really in talking about DE&I, the real question that's on everyone's minds is, how should brands incorporate diversity into their business, into their communication strategies? And most importantly, how do they bring about meaningful change? So I did look at my notes of the session, but I also since then did a little bit more research. So I hope you'll bear with me, because I'd like to update just a little bit, but it's all still within the theme of what we talked about. It's very clear that structural racism is alive and well in organizations and society. And that's not just within the U.S. It really has become a global problem, as well as global awareness. And significant work, this won't surprise us, is needed to ensure equity and parity. McKinsey recently put out a study and focused it specifically for this study. And I think they're going to be doing studies on different groups of people, but this one focused on Black employees. And it had said one of their findings was, at the pace of change today, that it will take 99 years for Black employees to achieve parity in the workplace. There's a pause there for a minute at 99 years. And with companies doing their best efforts, that number comes down. It comes down to 25 years. And that just assumes that everything else stays the same. So I think that's a pretty big rallying cry, that something needs to happen. Increasingly, as I'd mentioned, global diversity, equity, and inclusion is getting much more attention. We tend to initially think of DE&I as a U.S. issue, but it's moving even outside of the workplace and into society as we think about the globe, the world, and creating global citizens. And how do we do that if we don't have societies that are about equity and justice? A lot of it starts at work anyway, at the highest levels. And so there continues to be lots of research done on women on boards and how that is progressing along. Recent research showed in the US that 24% of women hold board positions in the publicly held companies within the US, and that's less than a 1% increase, by the way, over the previous year. In Australia, as an example, the proportion of women on the ASX 200 boards actually increased slightly, and that's at 32.1%. So you're seeing some increase there. In Africa, it's 19.1% women. In Asia Pac, 15.1%. Latin America, 8.3%, and in the Middle East and North Africa, it's 3.7%. And that the source for that data is the Corporate Women Directors International. So I just like to share that. While we didn't get into the session, this is some fairly recent data, and I thought it was really worth talking about and sharing with you on that front. So that still leads us to the question of how do you accelerate DE&I adoption? And what we're seeing, what's coming out most is certainly companies around the world are talking about DE&I, and even American companies that are, your multinationals that are located outside of the U.S. are paying a lot of attention to this outside of the U.S. as well, which is somewhat new. I think previously U.S. companies kind of stopped it at the U.S. and didn't really think about it further on. And of course, there's been a lot of attention lately around Indigenous peoples, not just in Australia, but also in Canada. But going back to the topic of how do we accelerate DE&I adoption, there's a wide view that it's time to take big steps and make big movements, not incremental movements. And one of those is not just knowing your numbers, but for companies to make bold public goals that they plan to reach with DE&I. As an example, I think Rand Corporation, or DuPont, I think it is, recently came out with some goals around 2025, what they intended to look like. And other companies are starting to follow suit around the world. I think that that's very encouraging. There's been lots of emphasis on incorporating equity, and the best way to do that is through transparency in organizations. So I think it's really interesting that that we're not seeing a lot around making sure you improve your pipeline, that it's going deeper than that. Another is to prioritize a culturally aware climate within your organization and within society. So there's an education component to that. And then following on that, I will say also implementing inclusive language in your company. So, and we're starting, of course, to see that happen around the world as well. Also, as part of that conversation, after Mark Carter spoke, we did have a panel with some of the alumni from the Diverse Future program, and they shared their perspectives. And I believe they were from IBM, Ethicon, and J&J Consumer Health. Not surprisingly, they all had positive things to say about the program and how actually that program has really helped them in their current role and in their future roles, and as they look to evolve in the organization and to grow in their careers. So I thought, all in all, it was encouraging, even if the growth is small and a bit discouraging. The other session that I thought was very, very timely and very interesting from my perspective was entitled "The Final Frontier of Stigma: The Role of the C-Suite in Addressing Employee Mental Well-Being." And our key speaker there was the CEO of Hyatt. And he spoke, it was very interesting because he spoke about the importance of employee well-being and felt that most companies were paying attention to employee well-being when the pandemic started. But then in the US, when George Floyd was murdered, and of course that reverberated around the world, that then really took everybody for a spin and created this kind of roller coaster effect within organizations. Hyatt also had partnered with some research to see just what's going on with employee well-being. And CCOs, 98% of CCOs felt that the issue of mental well-being is important, or felt the issue is important. But 67% said that employees are still concerned about judgment and negative impacts as a result within the company, as a result of coming forward to talk about being mentally unwell. And so there was very much a clarion call for CCOs to partner with their CEOs in that area, specifically to make it okay to be vulnerable. Also in that research, 85% of CCOs said that CEOs need to specifically address the issue which I found very interesting. And maybe when we get into the discussion, you all can we can talk a little bit about whether or not you're seeing that happen within your organization. As some of my takeaways that two takeaways, and then I will turn it back over. But that I found very interesting is that the Hyatt CEO used the word empathy and compassion a number of times. And I think even twice he said mindfulness, but I really focused in on the empathy. And for a CEO leader, and at least in my 3 decades in the workplace, to hear your CEO talk about the importance of showing empathy was very new, and I thought that really meant something. And we'll see if other CEOs are following suit. I personally happen to think that the new leaders need to lead with compassion and empathy. So I was glad to hear him say that. I just hope he's not a lone CEO. He also mentioned that that just about every corporation, every company has an employee assistance program, and he noted that the traditional employee assistance program, or EAP, is very insufficient for today's needs and for employees and what they really need in order to work effectively and in order to just be well. He noted that Hyatt had partnered with a medical college, I believe it was Cornell, to build a diagnostic tool to help Hyatt employees kind of assess what they are, where they are, and also to help Hyatt figure out what kind of resources they needed to provide. At the time of our session, of the spring session, I'm not sure how long they had the system in place, but he did mention that 8,000 employees voluntarily had gone through the diagnostic tool. And so I imagine that it's probably even bigger than that now, or larger than that now. So I think he laid out some pretty interesting lessons or thoughts that other CCOs can help create with their CEOs. But certainly, as I said, he mentioned empathy a number of times as being an important trait, not just for a CEO, but for the C-suite in general. And so those are my big takeaways from those two sessions. And with that, I believe, Mike, are you following me on this?
I am.
Great.
And let's just leave it here at this slide for a second. I've got 2 slides to depict 2 parts of the program that I want to cover over with you. But we went into the spring seminar with an idea that our theme was going to be redefining normal. And in short, what I would say is that none of us, after coming out of this spring seminar, really think that we're headed to a normal or a new normal, particularly in the fact that what we're all facing is pervasive change. And much more is going to be required of those of us who serve in senior communications roles than ever before. And this was underscored in a variety of ways, not just because we've gone through unprecedented disruption in the last year and a half, but at one point, Jeff Immelt, the former CEO of GE, told us that over the last year and a half, that actually the primary job of CCOs has now become the job of CEOs, in that both of them are now, full-time kind of managing crises and issues management, and how important that CEOs have become. And then I saw just the other, I guess it was just in the last 24 hours, a posting on LinkedIn from my friend who's on with us, Anna Whitlam, where she cited a study that had been done by Senate SHJ and the University of Technology at Sydney, that found that major Australian listed companies that experienced a reputation crisis lost on average $1 billion Australian in market capitalization and suffered a 30% drop in earnings per share. The study also found that share prices took at least 8 months of a year to recover, and in some cases, they didn't fully recover until years later. And almost without exception, the companies that recovered quickest were those that handled crises the best. So my focus today is really on two elements of change that I think increasingly CCOs are either managing themselves or are key players in managing them. And the first one, and we can change the slide now, goes to what we're seeing in terms of ESG pressure on companies, where we're kind of transitioning from scorekeeping to managing real business consequences. And we first of all had a terrific two experts in this space, actually part of this discussion, and Mark Tersick, who for 2 decades was a partner at Goldman Sachs and actually started that firm's first environmentally focused business and its first environmentally focused funds. And then after that, he spent a little over a decade, from like 2008 to 2019. He served as the CEO for the Nature Conservancy, one of the world's largest environmental nonprofits. So he brought a very interesting perspective to this whole conversation. And then Mila Craig is the founder of an organization called Milani, a Canadian-based firm that actually counsels investment firms and financial services companies on ESG matters. Previous to that, she had held a number of key roles in terms of managing institutional equity for Scotiabank and RBC Dominion, as well as she served in a significant sustainability role for Deloitte, a global accounting, consulting, and financial services advisory firm. Anyway, Mark's key points were it would be wrong for companies to think that they can simply pledge, net zero greenhouse gas emissions and then lie low. He said, because a lot of companies are out there saying, we're committed to net zero by 2050. And he allowed us that as 2030 draws nearer, there will be more pressure on companies to not only pledge to reach net zero by 2050, but many of them are going to be required by investors to show real progress by 2030 and have real action plans in place. Mark made the point that pressure will not just come from NGOs, it's increasingly coming from analysts, investors, and even employees. Money and capital markets, he stated, will more readily flow to companies with credible plans, and companies that demonstrate progress will also do better at vying for talent, particularly among millennials and Gen Zs. He also spoke to the increasing call for environmental justice, particularly in Europe and in the US, and said on the energy front, increasingly underserved and low-income communities will grow more aware of the impact of industry and energy infrastructure on their communities. There also will be greater sensitivity to cost, and thus navigating costs while also managing environment and energy transition will become a priority for companies. What companies and communicators need to recognize, he said, is that doing well by doing good matters more than ever before. And that translates into more than just CSR and sustainability reports, and also matters more than simple promises. Today, investors want progressive plans and increasing results because they see what is happening is having increasing financial materiality for publicly traded companies. Mila made a lot of the same points, She also added that not only money in capital markets is flowing to green companies, but nearly all companies must have a strategy for how they are navigating the energy environment transition, and that increasingly analysts and investors will be asking senior executives about how they're managing this. It is critical, she said, that CCOs have the ability to help management articulate how they will navigate in ways that are understandable to multiple audiences, from investors to NGOs, governments, employees, and prospective employees. He also said that most of the conversation today is centered around the E in ESG in terms of the environment, that increasingly she's witnessing investors, particularly in Europe right now, asking questions on the S and the G, that is the social and the governance components. She's witnessed analysts and investors asking pipeline companies about their relationships with indigenous communities. And in Australia, she said they're asking mining companies and others about their impact on from their operations on Aborigines. State and provincial governments in various parts of the globe are also asking about diversity, to the point just raised by Charlene, particularly as it relates to board composition relative to female representation. But in the US and Canada, that's also moving into territories around minority representation. There are also questions cropping up on the governance side, particularly around cybersecurity, but also around operational safety. She said analysts, investors, bankers, insurance companies, and credit rating agencies increasingly see these issues as financially material, if not in the near term, certainly in the long term. She also made the point that 90% of what analysts are looking at in terms of their financial evaluations these days are based on intangibles, and that depending on the nature of one's company, that 20 to 45% of that intangible value is now based on a company's reputation. Companies expect that CCOs will not only help them address these issues, but help manage these issues. She also made the point that the investor community is under the same scrutiny. There is no pension fund, she said, that wants to be on the front pages of a financial publication for investing in companies not doing the right things. She also made the point that transparency is increasingly important. Mila also said that investors are looking for or looking at corporate culture, and cited instances where investors were shifting money away from companies, particularly those in consumer-facing companies, where there were issues around employee turnover as well as customer relations. When it comes to ESG, she said, if you can show the ability to manage these issues and help the market understand why these issues are important and how you are managing them, you can build real economic and financial value over time. That said, she also made the point that you can destroy that value in short order in a single issue if it's mismanaged. In closing, Mila and Mark had offered a few parting words of advice to CCOs. Mila said, know the issues, understand how they link to strategy, be authentic, clearly build an understandable story related to your business's future, and then own it. And then Mark made the point about be clear about the strategy, look for how you do as a company, and look to create comparative advantage as a result of these efforts. Articulate how your organization makes the world a better place. Don't make grandiose claims that can't be supported by data and evidence. But also make clear that you can't overpromise. There are real rewards if companies are playing it straight. And then in the next panel, which was about risk intelligence, I have a quote here that's from Ralph Lauren's CCO, Katie Ionelli, which is, "Risk is tolerating discomfort." Now, I choose that quote, but the panel did offer up some concrete suggestions about what we can do to better tolerate that discomfort. And we had a terrific panel, Paul Rand, who used to be a senior team member for Ketchum and is now the VP of Communications at University of Chicago, really did a nice job of prompting each of the speakers. Dr. Boname Blanc, she said that the world we operate in is a perpetual crisis machine, and that CCO's jobs have increasingly become about constant risk mitigation. And I can personally underscore that fact. I know that when I was at Cargill as their CCO from 2010 to 2016, in 2011, I was actually named co-chair of the company's risk committee, along with the executive overseeing our commodities trading business. That said, she also talked about how companies manage risk, and that significantly, this is how they manage that risk is impacting share price, to the study that Anna had cited. She also articulated 8 items that build operational resilience. She said, lean in on governance, empower integrity, importance to have stakeholder EQ, emotional quotient, so understanding of stakeholders, risk intelligence. We talked about ESG strategy. The T in there was technology and how to best use technology to govern. And then also talked about performance equilibrium. You still have to perform. And then crisis readiness and innovate, and having an innovation ethos in a company was important. She made the point that as a result of all this, CCOs needed greater breadth and understanding of business fundamentals and potential business risks, and that CCOs increasingly would be called on to not just communicate about risk, but to actually prepare for and manage risks for their organizations. Vikram Sharma, who's the president of a company that actually provides some interesting tracking tools and engagement tools online, made the point that the volume, variety, and velocity of digital messaging is also driving the need for CCOs to better engage in the matter of monitoring and managing risk. He made the point that every minute of every day, there's 150,000 messages that are shared on Facebook in just a minute. In a minute, there are 41.7 million messages shared between WhatsApp users. And in just a minute, there's 55, there are actually 500 hours of video that are uploaded on YouTube. So there's little wonder that CCOs feel besieged and are in constant crisis mode. He also made some observations on the increasingly negative nature of a lot of that messaging, particularly about corporations, as well as that digital communications is giving more voice to fringe elements in the body politic. Given the proclivity of senior executives and boards to want to tamp down the negatives, he said that we're coming into what he called the decade of the CCO, and that might lead to larger responsibilities, larger budgets, and larger access to technology. He also made a point that what's going to be required are data tools that provide early warning systems that help us mitigate issues as well as make opportunities from what the data can tell us. Some of this is about accessing and assessing data more readily and more quickly. Some of it is by digging deeper to better understand connections between the voices and organizations on the internet, and still others will require deeper dives into the dark web. Katie pointed to the fact that we live in an environment where there's multi-stakeholder activism, and that creates special challenges all unto itself. Understanding the perceptions and expectations of those stakeholders is critically important. She talked about how at Ralph Lauren, they were doing a lot more scenario planning, attempting to navigate uncharted territory, also investing in some of the tools that Vikram had mentioned and exploring quantitative and qualitative data more deeply. And she added that it's important that CCOs push on this in their organizations and that they work very closely with their CEOs. She said, gone are the days where we can get by with just spinning. She also mentioned that Ralph Lauren has established a risk assessment committee that reports regularly to the board and that she is a part of that. She also underscored that having access to technology and data in and of itself is not enough. You need to have the right team. You need to have a good sense of the issues. You need to have the right insights, and you need the right judgment calls. And those judgment calls, those actions need to be aligned to the organization's purpose and values. So bottom line, across the board, I think what we saw is that whether it's ESG or risk management, there is much more for CCOs to do. And the role of the CCO inside many companies is increasing in importance. Let me stop there and turn the program over to Peter DiMassini. Peter?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks everybody for the presentations. Great to be able to catch up to some of the highlights. I think we have a few minutes, like 10, maybe a little more for Q&A and conversations. I'd perhaps throw the first question over to Sherry. I know, Sherry, you mentioned that compassion's a topic there as well with your CEO, but also there's a question probably about how the diversity conversations that we know a lot about in the US and in different parts of the world, here in Australia right now, I guess, in some areas, how those conversations are shaping up globally. So, Sherry, over to you as the first question and discussion topic.
Sure. Thank you, Charlene, Mike, and Roger for putting this together, and Peter for facilitating. I'm the head of corporate affairs for Zoetis, an animal health company. So it's okay. I'm holding my dog who's freaking out by the thunderstorm that's happening right now. So I'm on brand. But I wanted to talk a little bit more, Charlene and others here, if you could get into what is that global diversity conversation looking like? Because I think last year we all certainly had to address issues in the United States. And, my company and CEO felt very strongly about putting some metrics out there, as well as putting a plan in place that I think Charlene touches on all the areas you talked about. It's not just like the numbers today and hiring the people or the pipeline. It's a societal impact, it's your industry impact. And how can you make those changes? But when we get into the global conversation, our HR team is putting out talking about race in China. And I'm like, no, you didn't do that. Like, I tend to have this hunch that it's more about belonging and inclusion and belonging, but just wanted to open it up to this team and see how people are thinking about it. I hear another dog supporter. That's good. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sherry. I can just speak a little bit about what I'm seeing on the global conversation within corporations. I would say that companies are more sensitized to the fact that that diversity and DE&I issues are not kind of one size fits all around the world, but that there are issues in places other than the U.S. That need to be addressed. And so when I'm seeing more and more of our companies saying, what does our DE&I plan need to look like in the U.S., but what does it also need to look like in, in the UK? Or what does it need to look like in other geographies as well? So there's starting to be more conversation around the importance of what is sensitive and appropriate when you step out of the US, but at the same time, recognizing that it's more than a US problem, even though it seemed to be the murder of George Floyd that really got everyone's attention, but there were, the protests were worldwide. And so that's what I'm seeing and hearing the most. I don't know that they're particularly mature conversations at this point, but I give companies a lot of credit for for recognizing the difference.
So I wondered, Jen, if I can call on you, because with your HR hat on, as well as communications with John and a global company with a significant US presence, I thought you might have some perspective around this.
Yeah, I just posted something to Sherry, actually. We only just announced, so this is a very big subject for us. We're a Japan-based global company, but 50% of our employees are in Japan. So 30,000 are in Japan, and then 30,000 are outside of Japan, like everywhere else in the world. So that's our balance. Gender is a real issue for us. So we are focused on gender. And in fact, we started with the board. So we got the board to agree to gender parity, 50-50 as a ratio by 2030. Today, we're at 30%. So there's 10 directors, 3 of which are women. And I'm one of them. And then there's one foreigner, which is me. And our aim is to shift to 50-50. And we really needed the board to set the direction. Managers are going to be 30% of all leadership roles, which is managers and above, by 2030. But in Japan, it's 5.7%. So this is a very aggressive undertaking on our part. The strategy to get there, I mean, it's not just about the targets, is to focus on inclusion, because our belief is that if inclusion is the goal, diversity is the result. And this is on the basis of much study and research and consultation that we've had with our external and internal partners. We've done a lot of work to use gender as the proxy for our progress. So we've socialized within the organization that we will track and monitor gender and the progress we're making on gender across business units and in the organizations. But that's only because our hypothesis is if the organization is improving in its inclusiveness as a culture for women, then we know it will actually support all underrepresented communities. And of course, we'll track other communities, but with GDPR and our own limited resources, because we're not well suited yet, it's very hard to track other underrepresented communities. So we really wanted to focus in on what we could put our arms around. And so that's been our strategy so far. And it's actually going pretty well, because in Japan, for example, where it's mostly male, we have age diversity as a challenge. Now, of course, we can't talk necessarily about age too much in the West, because it's a very different context. In Japan, the shape, the demographic shape of our company is like a wine goblet, like 65, 64, 63, 60, and then like 20s, right? So when you put a younger person into a team, which is predominantly older, there is an inclusion issue there. So for us, if we can actually baseline inclusion, we're driving 3 areas: policies and practices. So a lot of HR policies and practices need to unbias how we actually do talent acquisition, talent promotion. All of that's being kind of reviewed. The second is, what does inclusive workplace look like? It's a partnership with the communications team and really making sure we have the right campaigns and socialization. The third area is around leadership development and setting what the leadership tone and voice and vocabulary needs to be around inclusive behavior and inclusive leadership and driving that. So there's formal education, sort of socialization and self-learning, and policies and practices. Those are the 3 work streams we're driving.
Cool. Thanks, Jen. I had a question for the 3 of you. A lot of what you talked about was the presenters at the conference talking about how the CCO can help manage the narrative. What's the messaging like? Does everybody understand what's happening? But it also seems like there are some issues that are more fundamental and strategic that the CCO can play a role at. Pace of change, for example, what issues to have a public stance about on the ESG side. How much of the discussion was about the role of the CCO as the business driver, as in addition to the communications, getting the narrative right?
Yeah, I'll start that. I mean, I think there were bits and drabs through different presentations. Foursquare at one point, literally, Jeff Immelt said that the role of the CEO is increasingly more aligned with the role of the CCO. And then you also had various people, as they talked about ESG, as they talked about various challenges, about how much more various C-suite officers and executives are pulling CCOs into kind of critical path issues that are related to strategy as well as mitigating challenges. So I think that what I heard and what I saw was that there is a reshaping of the role that's taking place across the globe. It's different in each company. It's different as various challenges come to the fore. But the bottom line is that what the expectation is of CEOs of CCOs is increasing.
Yeah, I agree with that, Mike. And I would just add that I think that in the time of the CCO panel that I mentioned briefly I may not have given it full justice because they were talking not just about the messaging, Peter, but about the fundamental decisions that the companies had to make in response to the pandemic about opening and closing and safety and mental health and all kinds of issues.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, I would just say that my own observation would be, and I think we've seen a lot of others agreeing with this, that we've seen stakeholder capitalism become an accelerating trend where in the ESG conversation, it's not just about mitigating the negatives, but it's about what companies can do to create positive societal change. And CCOs, I think, increasingly are close partners with the CEO and across the C-suite on that topic as well.
Cool. Thanks, Roger. And then I know Anna has a comment to make, and then we're getting close to the top of the hour. So we'll wrap up after Anna's thoughts here.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thank you all for pulling together, pulling today together, I should say. It's so wonderful to see everybody, particularly given what we've all been through, and I think most of us would like to be sitting around the same table right now. I love this conversation because it just does touch on so many things that we, I think, in Australia look to more mature parts of the world, particularly in the US and in Greater Europe, for direction on. Jin, I loved your sharing of what you guys are doing, and I think it's quite extraordinary, particularly given your background, that you're leading on, as a traditional CCO, you're leading on the things that actually really matter. And I'm not seeing, and I guess I wanted to make a point around the fact that I'm not seeing a lot of what you're doing in a lot of Australian corporations where it's been traditionally led by an HR function. So we have a lot of, I have a lot of organizations. I mean, most people here know that I lead an executive search firm, specializing in the disciplines that impact reputation. And every single one of the CEOs, non-executive directors, or HRDs that hire my firm to ask us to search, we're always given gender requirements, of course. We're given diversity requirements. But in actual fact, people don't want diversity because diversity is different. And so in Australia, if you actually present diversity, you're ticking all of the boxes, but the decision is always the same at the end of the day. And so you go around, you go to huge level to engage a very different audience and to get people to believe that you are actually, the organization is actually wanting to do something different. But in actual fact, the minute they're presented with diversity, they go back to what they're always used to having. And I mean, I have countless examples of this, but of course it's confidential and you can't say anything. And so I am heartened because I think that the more we start to see change infiltrate globally, the more we're going to start to see the impact. I do believe that it is our CCOs that will be leading on this, because the direct impact that we have on reputation and measurement of reputation, and we all know now that these sorts of decisions actually do make a difference at the end of the day. Mike, to your point around the attraction of talent, and particularly the millennials, to shareholder activism, to, you know, all of these sorts of things that make a firm valuable. The one area that I've done a lot of work on in the last 6 months has actually been on within the resources sector, the increase of Indigenous leaders, you know, as part of organisational leadership. And, you know, Brad, who's on the line now, and I talk a lot about this, you know, in terms of the level of education within that and the investment that organisations need to make to understand that there's still a big gap, but at least that we're moving in that direction. But I don't see it in any other sector. So it's, again, this is a great conversation because we learn from your experiences and then we try and bring them into this part of the world. So thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Appreciate it. And with that, we're right at the top of the hour. So thanks, everybody, for joining. Another great conversation. And thanks, Paul, for putting it together. Roger, Charlene, and Mike for bringing us the highlights of the conference. And with that, we'll wrap up. Thanks, everybody.
Peter, I think it was a great session, and thank you for closing. But I think we might also just try and see if we can do a more general conversation in the next month or two, because I know there's a lot of issues to that would value insights from Roger and Mike and Charlene on. So we might see if we can hold a more general conversation in the next little while. So thank you.